Guten Tag, WAP. This is Mr. Liniger. Let's make history today as we go over Unit 2, Day 7. And let's get started with our daily punishment. Long fairy tales have a tendency to drag on, dragon. Key terms for today: partition of Poland, the Caucasus, Siberia, the Great Northern War, the Law Code of 1649, Avacum, the Intelligentsia, Thick Journals, and Pugachev's Rebellion. We're going to analyze the political expansion of Russia during the early modern period. We're going to talk about the reasons for discontent in the early modern Russia, and we're going to talk about some of the cultural changes in Russia during this time period. So let's talk a little bit about the political scenario in Russia in the early modern period. Russia had a lot of neighbors: Sweden to the north, Poland to the west. Ottoman Empire is going to be Russia's biggest enemy to the south. Russia was upset and had a grudge that they conquered the Byzantine, who was like the Russia's parent. For the Russia to expand, they had to confront and defeat its enemies. Poland, Lithuania had tried to conquer Russia during its time of troubles. They remained a permanent enemy. Russia is slowly going to start to take over land. They absorbed the Ukraine and the former Russian capital of Kiev, and Ukraine will become part of Russia. In the Great Northern War, they defeat Sweden and they get some of the Baltic area. In the 1790s, Russia, Austria, and Prussia are going to divide Poland amongst themselves. Poland was not a stable government. They were a democratically elected monarchy, which meant like the government policies changed all the time. And Russia's and Poland's enemies, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, are just going to basically take over their whole country and divide it up amongst each other. There will be southern expansion of Russia into the Ottoman Empire territory. The Tsar's forces are going to push into the Balkans. They're going to be welcomed by Greek Orthodox minorities that had been previously conquered by the Ottoman Empire. They will be kind of halted from expanding further into the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is starting to weaken during this time, and Britain and France are worried about Russia becoming too powerful. It's the whole balance of power idea. This shows the three partitions of Poland when their whole country was stolen from them. The Caucasus are an area in Central Asia that kind of border parts of the Middle East. This is going to be the area that the Russians are going to send their Cossacks to create communities, to kind of be like a border patrol against nomads. Another area Russia is going to conquer during this time is Northern Asia, Northeastern Asia. This is called Siberia. They considered this necessary to prevent the return of the Mongols. Local people in Siberia will be forced to pay tribute in furs at Russian forts. For the native people of Siberia, they lived by hunting, fishing, and herding reindeer. Some of the indigenous people, like the Yakut, will try to resist, and they'll be brutally crushed. 70% of the population will be killed. Smallpox will also destroy a lot of these indigenous populations. Few Siberians will convert to Christianity. They'll remain shamanistic and animistic. By 1763, some Russian people will start to move to Siberia. The Russian government will also send convicts there, and they'll create prisons or gulags in Siberia, where they'll forcibly move them into Siberia. The Siberian population will also double with the addition of Cossacks, trappers, soldiers, serfs, and prisoners. The Russians will get all the way to the Americas. They'll actually colonize Alaska. And Russia will claim all the way to have parts of Canada and California. Let's talk a little bit about their economic system. Russia is still going to be rural and agricultural. The center of Russian life is the village. They're going to have churches, local markets. It's going to be very isolated. They had large extended families. The male was the head of the household. He ran village affairs. Life was hard. Men worked in fields, women in harm, and at home. There was great illiteracy. At first, Russian serfdom looked like it was going to end before the 17th century. Serfs were bound to the nobles' land and crown and monasteries. In Siberia, peasants were mostly free because they had to live in freaking Siberia, where it was always like negative 40 degrees, as payment for settling there. On the steppes, Cossacks were mostly free. In return, they defended the border of Russia in the steppes. A lot of the serfdom will change with the Law Code of 1649. This will place the serfs directly under control of the landlords. Serfs are not slaves, but they could be sold as private property, so it's pretty close to slavery. They also have fixed occupational jobs or castes. Sons are going to be forced into the trades of their fathers. Catherine the Great, in return for having the boyars and nobles supporting her westernization policies, will give them even more greater control over the serfs. Europeans will trade with Russia in the mid-16th century. Russia will be a major grain exporter. There will be a focus on industrial development under Peter the Great. Peter the Great will invite Europeans to Russia, like engineers, shipbuilders, officers, and teachers, to teach the Russians for westernizations. There's going to be a very small urban working class in Russia. The government will subsidize factories and industries. This will be kind of different than Western Europe. The government will be very heavily involved in industrialization, where in Western Europe, like they believe in capitalism, so the government's not as involved in industrialization in factories. Like, for example, in Russia, they could draft serfs to work in their factories, where like in Western Europe, the factory workers were technically free. The population in Russia will double in the 18th century from 15 to 30 million. The population will be primarily rural. Most people lived in villages and hamlets. Cities were rare. You have some cities like St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Kiev, and a few smaller other ones. There will be some people that are not happy with what's going on in Russia. There's going to be some efforts to reform the Russian Orthodox Church. This will be led by some people that were unhappy with the teachings of the Orthodox Church. They thought it was outdated. The Patriarch of Moscow, Nikon, is going to promote reform. He wanted to standardize Orthodox rituals. He wanted to promote religious instruction in Greek and Latin. He will be backed by the czars, but he's going to be denounced by some conservatives who thought he was too liberal. One of these conservatives was called Avvakum. Avvakum was a priest and a religious leader. He's going to form a group of Orthodox called the Old Believers. They refuse to accept Nikon's reforms. They also attacked the government's policies on serfdom and taxation. Their beliefs are going to be considered a threat by the czar, and they're going to be outlawed. Avvakum himself will be executed by treason. The Old Believers will not be wiped out, but they'll have to go to like the Dunes of Russia to try to get away from the czar, and they'll go to like isolated communities. Eventually, some of the Old Believers will move all the way to the Americas. The czars during this time will take more and more control over the Orthodox Church between the 16th and 18th century. Peter will change the calendar. He'll introduce Western practices. He'll make the Orthodox Church part of the state. And Peter the Great was considered the Antichrist by the Old Believers. He wasn't very religious. He persecuted the Old Believers. They did not like him. Let's finish up by talking about the Enlightenment in Russia. Peter the Great is going to push for Westernization and the Enlightenment in Russia. He's going to introduce Western culture like ballet, literature, and Western European ideas. He's going to recognize the role of education in Western progress. He'll create the first secular education for elementary schools in capital cities. He'll found the Academy of Sciences. Catherine the Great is going to expand elementary schools to all children except serfs. She'll also introduce more ideas of the Enlightenment into Russia. She'll introduce Western literature. She'll promote Russian literature. She was a great friend of Voltaire. She's going to promote the idea of inoculation against smallpox. That's where you're given a little bit of the disease to inoculate you against it. A lot of people at this time period thought it was a bad idea, but she supported that scientific idea. There is going to be a new unofficial social class in Russia called the intelligentsia. The intelligentsia were intellectuals who supported ideas of the Enlightenment. They're going to compile and publish like different excerpts and works from the Enlightenment, like parts of books. These are called thick journals. At first, these groups of people will be encouraged by Catherine the Great, but they will be censored by the government. They will not publish like those democratic ideas from like John Locke and stuff like that. Some of the intelligentsia will advocate for the abolition of serfdom and more liberalism. These are the groups of people that will be more likely to be censored. A lot of the intelligentsia and the support of the intelligentsia will end after Pugachev's rebellion and the French Revolution, which is going to kind of scare Catherine the Great away from the Enlightenment. All right, guys, that's all I have for you for today. Until next time, deuces, deuces, deuces. I like thick journals and I cannot lie. Your other brothers can deny.